Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning or this afternoon or wherever you are in your part of the world. And welcome to the Soufan Center's webinar event. Today, in a special collaboration with the Soufan Group, we are hosting a discussion on managing the security risks of working online and remotely during the coronavirus pandemic. For your background, and in case you are joining us for the first time, my name is Emerita Torres, and I'm the Director of Policy Research and Programs at the Soufan Center. The Soufan Center is a nonpartisan strategy center focused and dedicated to increasing awareness of global security issues in the United States and around the world. The Soufan Group is a global intelligence and security consultancy that helps clients in the public and private sectors enhance their ability to identify, assess, and successfully operate in high-risk, high-opportunity environments. Thank you again for joining us today. And this topic is one of extreme importance to so many of us working from home. With the spread of COVID-19, governments, businesses, communities, faith-based organizations, nonprofits, and beyond are implementing remote work and communication practices. While the Soufan Center has been extensively covering the geopolitical, security, and humanitarian implications of COVID-19, this discussion will focus on the immediate implications at home and in the remote work environment, as well as practical ways to address some of these challenges, particularly drawing on the Soufan Group's expertise navigating some of these complex and high-risk environments. We have a really impressive group of speakers with us today who are going to guide us in dealing with and approaching some of these issues. And so I'm going to introduce them briefly to you all. First, we have Amar Barghouti. He is the Director of Cyber Consulting and Cyber Training at the Soufan Group. He was also an FBI special agent specializing in cyber threats, computer intrusion, and cyber terrorism. Next, we have Phil Caudell. He's the president of the Consulting and Strategic Planning Division of the Soufan Group. Before joining the group, Phil was the global president of client services at Group M, the world's largest media planning, buying, and analytics network. And then finally, we have Andre Khoury, who is the vice president for strategic partnerships at the Soufan Group. He is a 22-year veteran of the FBI and former VP for global security at Goldman Sachs. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping issues. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and shared on our website and social media after the event. And thank you very much for submitting your questions via email in advance. Please have your questions ready for the end of the presentation portion of today's webinar. And please note that you can also ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. We will not be taking questions live over audio, and therefore we will not be using the raise your hand function on the webinar today. So with that, we will start with our first speaker, Andre Khoury. He's the vice president again for strategic partnerships at the Soufan Group. I'll turn it over to Andre.
Thank you, Amarita, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. In today's climate, we realize many concerns exist when working remotely. Some of these concerns we will be addressing in this session, such as cyber attacks, rogue infiltration, and disinformation. But also, let's not forget about physical security and its impact on our company employees during these trying times. Much of what I will be discussing today in this physical security section is common sense, and probably it's something already addressed by your companies if you have a security departments. So I will just keep my presentation short and to the point. In a time like we are going through now, we need to make a minute and assess the risk of third-party elements entering our spaces. With minimal or no personnel on site, safeguarding property, personnel, records, sensitive information, and the like is a priority. I know with our company, one day we all were at the office, and overnight we began working from home. We didn't have much notice to properly prepare, and I'm sure many of you experienced the same change in operations. When working in a normal environment, we depend on security we have in place every day. To this extent, we need to ensure security cameras, alarms are functional and determine how they are being monitored. Is it by staff? Did we transfer it to virtually being monitored from an outside security company? We need to look into any tests being conducted to ensure they are working properly. And we also need to look into, can they be conducted remotely or must they be done in person? Whichever way you look at it, a plan should be put in place to deal with any issues or malfunctions. I would also look into to see if recordings and logs are being saved properly in case the need arises in the future for a legal or any other reason. One good practice to consider is retaining data longer and beyond standard practices in times like we are right now. Every company should have routine security protocols. These protocols must remain in place, so there is no need to recreate the wheel. Having said that, it is recommended to review emergency operation plans, ensure they address low and no occupancy periods, and adjust them as needed, and of course, relay any changes to your staff so there will be no surprises. When the workforce is lacking inside a workspace, we all know opportunities for nefarious individuals to cause harm exists, and measures should be taken to potentially mitigate any of those risks. In times like now, when we all have a lot to do and a lot on our plate, one thing we often overlook is Mother Nature. We need to be mindful of that. It can do a lot of damage to our structures when no one's paying close attention. Recently, some part of the country had lots of rain and high winds. If an issue is not caught in time, it could have devastating effects on our offices, structures, and of course, our budget. Some simple solutions could be just to assign someone who lives close to your facility, just to drive by and conduct spot checks to ensure all is good. It is also a good standard to keep detailed records of these drive-bys and spot checks for insurance purposes, if we ever need it down the road. Another area would be to probably just view cameras and speaking with neighborhood companies in the area if we have any connections with them. That could possibly do the trick without putting anyone at high risk or any exposure. In the last 10 years or so, we all recognize many companies are leasing or building in less desirable areas to reinvigorate the economy and to reduce costs. If your place is one of those and it is vulnerable, especially if it's a standalone building, you need to notify local law enforcement and request additional patrols during certain times of the day and night. Trust me on this one, police departments and sheriffs have a plan in place and they expect this to happen. So don't hesitate to call them. In certain instances, you may have to augment your security staff on hand. I realize adding cost nowadays is the last thing any company needs, but it may be necessary and someone has to make that hard call. Damage, vandalism, graffiti, theft will add more unneeded stress on your operations during these current times and will cost much more than adding 1 or 2 security guards at the end of the day. Like our company, many of you are tenants in buildings. I would encourage you to closely work with your building management and other tenants to ensure everybody is on the same page during these tough times. Since we are all in the same boat, this is a time we can help each other to minimize staff exposure and minimize in-person visits. Have a roster and an open communication plan to speak with security staff during each shift. Find out who are the employees designated by other companies sharing your building and have their phone and email addresses handy. Speaking with outsiders in tough times is actually something that is different than just speaking with your own circle. And it helps us cope a little bit better with the situation. It has proven beneficial to do that. Lastly, and most importantly, now is the time to start planning ahead. We have had the coronavirus for a number of weeks, and we have all been working remotely. As much as some of us like working from home, let's face it, eventually everybody's going back to work. Everybody needs to have a comprehensive return to work plan in place. This plan will ensure the safety and comfort of your employees after we all wake up from this nightmare Let's be real, this crisis is something most of us have never experienced before and is going to stick with us for a while. We need to develop a sound and logical return plan to our staff to get things back on track as quickly as possible. Here's the bottom line. When the time comes, your place of work must be prepared to reopen without any delays and operates as you did before the crisis. Most of us has already incurred significant losses to this point, but planning ahead will reduce any further damage to our companies. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Andre, for that presentation on physical security. And as you know, it sounds really like it's common sense, and it is, but so many companies and small businesses really take the physical security risks and ways to mitigate them for granted. So thank you for raising those points, especially the security protocols that really need to be in place to ensure that our physical workspaces are not at risk or compromised. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to turn it over to Amar Barghouti. He's the Director of Cyber Consulting and Cyber Training for the Soufan Group. He's going to walk us through how to protect and how to think about cyber attacks and rogue infiltration. So I'll turn it over to Amar.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending. I just wanted to start off kind of with what we're looking at here. So we've been kind of in the situation right now with especially with the remote work that was suddenly thrust upon a lot of us for a few weeks now. And I know a lot of the attendees already have information security officers, whereas some don't, being smaller entities and the whatnot. Also, a lot of our different community organizations, like our faith-based organizations, our mosques, our synagogues, our churches, may not be pretty much well set up. But even for companies that did have remote work protocols that may have applied to a certain number of people or a very limited part of the workforce, now all of a sudden thrust upon us is a lot of people that are doing the remote work, and we may not have had enough time to prepare, for instance, issuing them with proper equipment and all that kind of stuff. And some of them may be digging up some old equipment out of the closet to use. So, and I know just even ordering tech right now may take may have a long lead time due to the supply chain disruptions. So what we're looking at here is, some really basic, steps, like 3 steps. And the reason why we're only going with 3 steps is because if you really overwhelm your workforce with a lot of steps and you're trying to secure completely, people will just tune out and not do them. Whereas these 3 will mitigate most threats that a lot of the smaller or medium-sized organizations will face. We're not necessarily protecting against, the People's Liberation Army in China or the GRU or anything else like that, but we are looking at the more criminal or nefarious elements out there. So the 3 threats that we're looking at is going to be the social engineering, passwords, and updating the systems. So we'll start off with social engineering. This one is absolutely the way that most nefarious actors will try to get into and infiltrate your systems and try to do some damage. The reason why is, it's a lot easier than and takes a lot less talent than trying to develop a 0-day exploit or some kind of technical exploit to get into a system. Why try to pick a lock when you can have the owner just open the door for you? And here we're using employees that would be the gateway, whether through phishing emails, again emails with nefarious links or malicious links attached to them, or even via telephone calls. And the social engineering experts, the ones that will be out there doing this, are very good at it. They use it because it works. You've seen sort of the same way when high pressure sales tactics are on you. It's you got to sign now, the deal's going to go away, this, that, but we'll transfer it to a work environment. And one thing also to be cautious of when you're a social engineering, to protect yourself against a social engineering attack, is also be really aware of what you're putting out there in social media, or what your employees are putting out there in social media. For somebody, if they're specifically targeting your company, your entity, your organization, they will use social engineering as a great reconnaissance point to start out, and they'll build familiarity where and you get legitimacy when they start mentioning people that you know and within your company. And again, with social engineering, it is much easier to have the employee open the door than for the criminal trying to pick the lock. Moving on to passwords. So weak passwords are still a major vector for a lot of nefarious activities. And best practice right now would be to use passphrases or encourage the use of passphrases. So they're a lot more difficult to guess. Again, my dog Spot loves kibble, and you basically would throw in different characters for different words in there. And using unique passwords are also really good for each different system that requires a password. I know everybody's guilty of reusing passwords. I am guilty of that. But getting into the habit of at least modifying the passwords between different systems so that a compromised password in one does not open the door to another. Password managers would come in very handy. Just a little anecdote on passwords. I know in the FBI, when on a couple of occasions when I'm looking at data recovered from the bad actors, so to speak, and we're looking at the spreadsheet that they put together of usernames that they've compromised, usernames, email, and passwords, and we look at the unhashed passwords that they had. And password 123 is just always comes up. So it was kind of like, us agents would kind of look at each other. It's like, wow, that is still a thing. Let me in was another big one. So a lot of people will kind of use those. And if you don't want some law enforcement person chuckling at your password, please do not use those. Multi-factor authentication is wonderful. You'll see a lot of banks are using that. I know the U.S. government is kind of requiring that for their websites right now. And multi-factor is extremely difficult to defeat, also known as two-factor. The simplest explanation, and I know a lot of people already know this, but I'm going to reiterate it, is multi-factor combines something that you know, your password, and something that you have, either a smartphone, like with the military, it's a PIV card, or even an RSA token, one of those tokens with the rolling numbers, or an authenticator app also on your smartphone. And while a perpetrator may be able to get to know something that you know, for them to physically get a hold of something that you have is a completely different order of business. They may be thousands of miles away and will never be able to access what you have. So for most, again, non-major nation state actors, this is something that's extremely difficult to overcome. Highly recommend, if you have a way to turn on that feature, definitely put multi-factor. It will probably save you a lot of grief in the long run. The next things I touched upon, which was the old systems. So again, you had a few employees working remotely. Now you have a lot of employees working remotely. And again, a lot of people generally are used to have moved away from your PCs or your MacBooks or anything else like that. And they're using smart devices, or they're using their phones, they're using their tablets, but now they got to use maybe a PC, and they'll get that old laptop and it's got Windows 7 on it, which is no longer supported. That is a strong vector for nefarious actors to get in. Again, very difficult to estimate how many Windows 7s or even XPs are out there in the world. Some estimates, I know from ZDNet, had a maybe at about 200 million worldwide. Again, difficult to know which ones are actual installations, which ones are maybe virtual machines, but 200 million is still out there. Windows 7 was a beloved operating system for a lot of people, and they really don't want to move away from that. But also, maybe again, for your folks digging up old tech, that's what they may be operating. Again, there's no patches, there's nothing new. The exploits are out there. And moving, if we do like other considerations, just really quickly, the communication plan, please have one in place. That is absolutely important, especially to counter social engineering. If you have somebody who knows who to call when they get a suspicious call or suspicious email, and they can notify somebody responsible in the organization saying, hey, I got this odd call, somebody who's trying to get my password. Well, that might not be the only person who is getting that call. and a communication plan and a dedicated, for instance, inbox or a dedicated channel to report these incidences would be crucial to educate the workforce. And you can blast out saying, hey, we're getting these calls, these are scams, do not do this. Plus you can also say, hey, anybody that did give out a password, we'll declare amnesty, please tell us. And so that we can mitigate whatever damage may have happened because of that. The other thing is make sure that people know to use secure Wi-Fi if they're on a Wi-Fi, which everybody would be at home. And by secure, a lot of people still use default. They unbox their Wi-Fi. They it said Netgear and default password. Those are still out there. A lot of actors will drive around neighborhoods with a scanner and kind of looking for unsecure Wi-Fi spots, and they can enter that way. Not too concerned about people using unsecured Wi-Fi at Starbucks right now, because Starbucks are open, but when they do, do not use those. The other thing is backups. A lot of entities, a lot of folks have backups, but unfortunately, a lot of folks never tested the backups. They never tried to do a full system restore from the backups, and a lot of folks are very unpleasant or are unpleasantly surprised when they do try to do a restoration, especially if they were hit with a ransomware attack, which is kind of the most common types of attacks, where a person gains access to the system and will encrypt all your files and demand Bitcoin in return. I know on the cyber terrorism side, our big worry was that a terrorist organization actually will encrypt your hard drive and then demand $10,000 in Bitcoin, and then what do? Do you get your files back and inadvertently commit material support to a terrorist organization, or do you just lose all your files and suffer tremendous losses? But moving on from that, why would somebody want to infiltrate your system? I think we go on to our topic of infiltration. And aside from the financial motives or anything else like that, your organization or your congregation may be targeted for infiltration. Right now, with the online meetings and that are just, we're going to religious services, we're going to a lot of things on different platforms, Zoom being very prominent. Again, our nefarious actors may be going in to infiltrate to do different things. For instance, social networks can be infiltrated to spread disinformation, which we'll get into disinformation with Phil later on. But the community groups could be infiltrated for harassment. So I compare that is you think of again, it's a defaced website or a web page of a church or of a synagogue or of a mosque. Okay, not much financial damage you can recover from that, or even somebody coming into a meeting and taking off their shirt with and have a big swastika on it and intimidating folks at a temple. Okay, no big financial losses there. However, you think about the effects on the people, especially that there have been physical attacks, there have been arson, there has been everything else like that. I call it like a virtual cross burning. So again, somebody lights a cross in front of your house, not much in terms of financial damage, but a lot of damage otherwise, and a lot of like loss of the feeling of security that goes with that. Organizations can be infiltrated. So if you're having a big meeting on a platform and a competitor gets in and infiltrates when they shouldn't infiltrate, when they shouldn't be there, or even something where somebody's looking at your trade secrets, or even foreign actors coming in to do that, that would be another reason why they would infiltrate, would be to get your commercial information. We've all heard the term Zoom bombing. So Zoom bombing isn't specific to Zoom right now. The way things are moving really fast, Zoom bombing is kind of a generic term now. So think of the, making copies, Xeroxing. Doesn't mean that you're using a Xerox machine, but everybody's using Xeroxing. So when we talk about Zoom bombing, that's kind of real prevalent right now. Really straight to, it's a disruption of a virtual meeting with graphic or threatening messages, hate speech, using the chat feature, putting backdrops with really disturbing messages, or even annotating the screen and doing all sorts of different harassing things. Zoom's getting a bit better at, they're rolling out a patch almost every other day. But that being said, consider what you're doing on a platform like Zoom, or if you want to move to a much more secure platform or something that's kind of maybe controlled somewhere else, think about who may be owning Zoom. If it's something you're willing to present at a conference room at the Marriott, then Zoom is perfectly fine. If it's something that you are discussing that's extremely sensitive, you may want to consider other platforms. Again, things that you would not discuss at a conference room at the Marriott or Hilton or wherever you may be. Something that you'd want to discuss in a more secure place. Definitely rethink your platform. And with that, I'll move it on to back to Marita.
Thank you so much, Amar, for that important guidance on cyber attacks and the Zoom bombing phenomenon that we're seeing. So many important points to unpack that you've mentioned, from the communication plans and even the simplest things as the kinds of passwords we choose, and the multi-authentication piece it's so incredibly important, especially during these times where we are working remotely. And I just add that the points you make on the vulnerabilities triggered by the coronavirus pandemic and how it's opened up opportunities for rogue actors, like white supremacists, for example, to infiltrate our work systems and meetings is very well taken. I've seen so many examples of this myself from the top to the bottom. So it's something we certainly need to keep in mind. I'm going to turn things over now to Phil Caldell. He's the president of the Consulting and Strategic Planning Division over at the Soufan Group. He's going to walk us through how information is becoming weaponized. We talk a lot about disinformation and misinformation, and we throw those terms around, but they're really just subsets of a wider picture of how information is broadly becoming weaponized in our daily lives, including as we work remotely. So I'll turn it over to Phil to walk us through that.
Marita, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As we think about the sort of fourth dimension here, what I'd like to do is just sort of start with some definitions, if that's okay. I'm just going to share my screen. And as Marita says, it's bigger than fake news. It's bigger than just disinformation. It is the weaponization of information, and propaganda and using information to influence people has been around forever. But why is it now, and certainly at times of crisis, so prevalent? It's because of the digital revolution. It's never been as fast, as scaled, as impactful, and cheaper to do in history. So it's being used by rogue actors, and whether these are rogue nations, non-state actors, so extremist organizations, organized crime, or sort of rogue lone wolf individuals, everyone now has the ability to deploy information in a rogue way. And frankly, if it's by a country, or if it's by an extremist organization, we call that communications warfare, because that's what it is. If it's by an organized crime or rogue individual, it's communications crime, because that's what it is. And these things have to be treated as warfare and crime, and not just as something that happens as an acceptable part of the way the media works these days. Just to give you a framing of this, disinformation, misinformation, a lot of people use these words almost interchangeably. Disinformation is intentionally false, intentionally inaccurate information. So I'm telling you something, I know it's false, and I'm insinuating and inserting it into a conversation. Misinformation is unwittingly false. So I may have heard something that was told to me as disinformation, but I may believe it to be true, and then I share it. It's now misinformation. So literally the same factoid could be both dis and mis, depending on if you're the originator or you're the sharer. The other one, and this ties back to some of the things that we were talking with Amar, is malinformation. As we all get really good at blocking, spear phishing, and limiting the ability of people to sort of hack into our business networks, people are going to attack us through social media, and they're going to try and attack us at home, which during a COVID time is definitely an accelerated risk. And what we've seen is a new one called malinformation, where knowing the things that get shared the most of the disin and misinformation content, the bad guys are embedding malware into everything from the puppy video to the pretend announcement on how if you have ice cubes, you're not going to get the virus. And these things being pushed out are now embedding malware that's used to infect your system and also steal your data. So malware is the third. The fourth, and I want to add, is missing information, which is we've seen in very many countries and also some communities within our own country, the absence of fair and balanced reporting. So if there's intentionally missing information that doesn't present the other side, then we have a context of still a weaponization. So dis, miss, mal, and missing are sort of the four horsemen of the information apocalypse. And let's talk a little about how they're being deployed. Now, Homeland Security have been trying to help educate folks, certainly in the US, to know when you're being disinformed. So I think that the first issue we've got to think about is an educational response. I'd refer anybody to the Homeland Security website and the CSER group. They published this very simple 5-step, which is recognize the risk, question the source, investigate the issue, think before you link, we like that one, and talk to your inner circle. So when you see something, and there was some emails going around that sort of were purporting to give you advice on how to avoid COVID, there's also been the information about which surrogate drugs you could take, protect you. Recognize that it may not be true. Question the source, work out where it's coming from, investigate it, check to see if that thing's been validated in 2, 3, 4 other places. Think about it before you forward it to your friends, and then talk to your trusted group to see whether they have heard of it, they support it, and they've found validation to it. So recognize, question, investigate, think, and talk. So that would really be great advice for everybody on how to know when information is being weaponized and you are the target. Going beyond that, though, we actually see that this is so widespread now and systemic that it needs a systemic response. And because this is all about a lack of trust, we call it Project Trust. So what we help people understand is which types of disinformation topics are most impactful, who is most vulnerable and who can be exploited with the information, how can you identify and quantify the risk, how should it be countered, and very interestingly, by whom. So to help people combat when they're being the victims of dis and misinformation and malinformation, we provide baselines of topics that are being used for discord. The COVID analysis is fascinating. The combination of factors of different focus on different ethnic groups, different languages, different cultures. You've got the anti-vaxxers, you've got the deep states, you've got the QAnons, you've got the anti-pharma people, the anti-Russians, the anti-Semites, all rolled up into this confusion about this topic. And you've got to understand how those topics and subtopics work, and then develop a message threat assessment and an early warning system. You've got to identify the vulnerable audiences and work out how to protect them. And then you can predict what people are going to do, and then you can design countermeasures. So this really is a more systemic response that I'm going to share a little of as we go through today. Now, there are 2 key components to this, and one and the first is this sort of disinformation communications ecosystem model. So if you as a company, as a community, as an organization are being attacked, the first thing to know is to sort of understand how, and then build out an understanding of the bad guys. So that's the first part, is that we role play the rogue actor and understand how they're attacking the target. And the second thing is we build out an assessment and intervention system. So I'll give you a very quick intro to both of those. So the model here is very simple and straightforward, and whether we're talking about a white supremacist group, whether we're talking about a rogue nation when we've got elections, and might be an issue here in the US sometime soon, is it starts out where the rogue actor will look at what topics they can identify and what content they can develop that could already be divisive, that they can amplify, or could be divisive if they insinuate it into a conversation. When we ran analysis on the 2016 US elections, it was really interesting. The IRA bot file and the Internet Research Agency of Russia that was used as part of the attack on the US. Of all of the messaging, 2.2% of the messages were about election. They're trying to disrupt elections. 80% of messages were about race. So they identify the issues that are divisive, and then they amplify them. They then, once you've got the message, the seed message, you've got to distribute it. Now, what we've seen, and certainly with the role of social media, and we're seeing through the COVID crisis, is individuals and organizations are the first point of distribution. Then social media, and then traditional media to pick up, report, and validate. So these distribution and dissemination channels really break into those 3 categories, and they go up and down within the range, but each campaign uses those in different ways. But Their role is to influence an environment which is both the community and the people within it. And within these communities, we see the sort of neutral opens in the middle, and we see both the receptive supporters who want to believe what they're being told, that's disinformation, and you have the rejecter skeptics who will never believe what they're being told. You could think this in a religious context, in a political context, in a commercial context. And so what we find here is that depending on the rogue actor, they may target different components within this spread and put different messages in to the middle, the left, and the right. Now, what they're then going to do over at the left-hand side is work out, does this idea work? Is it getting traction? Does it grow amongst the believers? Does it elicit response from the non-believers? And does it morph or seed or create another issue? So they drop in an idea, they distribute it, they work out the response of people, they see how it's growing. And then if it's going well, it keeps going around the cycle. So in this way, you can look at a state-sponsored disinformation campaign to influence US election, or you could look at something as specific as attacking an individual company. So some of the examples that play to this model: elections we've talked about, we're monitoring from the US 2016 all the way through to 2020. In the health area, anti-vax is a huge area and being exploited with disinformation. Infrastructure, 5G has been a huge topic of this. Environment, climate change, and the global warming hoax, etc., is a massive territory for disinformation. Health, absolutely, with COVID-19, the spread and diversity, and also the conflagration of different ideas in the COVID-19 disinformation is quite incredible. So how do you know what's true of everything you're receiving? And areas in the private practice like welfare, animal testing have been very, very significant. So you want to understand how you're being attacked, how the rogue actors are using it. And then once you do that, you've got to work out what you do about it. So here really our advice is in the first, which is sort of number one, understand what the base topics are that relate to you, your community, and your stakeholders. And social media monitoring is a wonderful way of doing this. So understand the sort of Discord topics and then track them so you know what's elevating and what could be a risk to you, your audience, and your community. Then when you start to see these messages, getting one and extracting one Facebook post or one tweet, it's okay, but you want to look at the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, the millions to understand at scale. So for this, you need to run analytics at scale on a campaign level and on an individual message level. Once you're doing that, you're then able to build out a threat assessment and predict both the message impact, but also the audience impact. So really effective message to really volatile and vulnerable and exploitable people, you get a red threat assessment very, very quickly. So what we can then do is then track individuals' actions post-exposure and move that into, if we understand how they're reacting, what they're reacting to, how does that then inform the countermeasures? So we go into number 5, message creation and distribution. So it's very simple. Understand what the bad guys are doing to you, and then use this 5-step plan to both identify the risk, quantify it, assess how and who's being exploited, and then identify and define how you should respond. So yeah, with Emerita, that's really the way that we've got to think about the weaponization of information and how to keep ourselves safe. And in a time like COVID-19, this is accelerated because there's more content, there's more confusion, there's a lack of clarity, and there's greater opportunity for the bad guys. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Bill. Really helpful breakdown on how information is being weaponized and what companies and organizations can do to really address this. I think it's important, as you mentioned, to take a systems approach to this. I really like the phrase you use, the think before you link. I feel like that should be on a keychain or a t-shirt as we're thinking about disinformation and what we're sharing. And also the fact that we as humans, as individuals, are vectors for disinformation too. And the point you raise on that disinformation stops with you is incredibly important, because we have to think about what we're sharing individually, as well as what companies and organizations can do at a more systemic level to really counter some of these disinformation threats that we see. So now I'm going to transition to the moderated part of our discussion. I'll remind you first a little bit about what we discussed. So we've covered 4 important topics today: physical security risks, cyber attacks, rogue infiltration, and the weaponization of information, and how we can address these challenges, particularly in the remote workspace of our businesses and our organizations and our communities. I'm going to start the question and answer session, and I'll use a bit of my moderator privilege to kick us off. But for audience members, please note that you can send your questions through the Q&A function of Zoom, and I'll be looking for that and for your questions. So I'll start with my first question, and I'll pose it to Andre, who discussed physical security risks. So the world will look very different when we return back to our physical workspaces. And I sure hope, like you all, that we'll be able to return to work fairly soon when it's safe to do so. But we should really start planning for this return soon, as Andre mentioned, to ensure really that the security and the safety of our spaces and our employees are sound. And so with that understanding, you know, this is the first time for nearly all of us, probably in our lifetimes, to be forced to work from home and for such an extended period of time. So we should be really thinking about this, planning for this now. So my question is, what really goes into a comprehensive return to work plan so that we can ensure that security and the safety of our employees are intact?
Thank you, Amrita. I mean, that is the $1 million question. There was so many things that companies can do to ensure that. I mean, in my mind, let's simplify it, and then we'll just break it down into 3 areas. They're going to be some type of a sanitization protocol. You're going to have some cluster zones that we need to work with. You need to work about travel policy and corporate messaging. So those probably will be the areas. And, you know, some of them are going to vary from very simple to some that are a little bit more challenging. So, you know, having masks on hand and sanitizers, you know, spread around the office. I mean, I know before this happened, none of that was a consideration. You know, now that's something that we need to consider for our employees, for our visitors. You know, do we need to add more cleaning staff during the hours of the day so they can, you know, roam around common areas and wipe down knobs and desks and so forth and so on. You can also up it a little bit if you want to maybe having some temperature check stations at the beginning of the return to work, just so you can ensure that people, you know, so they know that we are doing something about it. So that's one way. Obviously, you know, limiting the entries and the exits into buildings, you know, having a one way in, one way out, that will be another area that we need to look into. You know, securing people in elevators, you know, how is that going to be? But, you know, one thing that jumps to mind, and that is, you know, handling of mail. You know, handling of mail is always a big challenge, even in sane times. Can you imagine how it's going to be now with COVID-19 when everybody's been told that this virus lives on porous surfaces, solid surfaces? I mean, that's going to be a huge issue for any company. So that's something that you need to look into ahead of time and ensure that it's not going to disrupt your work. Your people are going to be comfortable. I mean, I'd just give a very small example on this, and it may not necessarily relate because it's a little bit more egregious, but a lot of us probably remember when the white powder envelopes were being sent around the United States. You know, it drove everybody crazy, including us in the FBI back then, trying to figure out how we're going to mitigate that and mainly how we're going to catch the people. But we're talking about the mitigation here. I know that there was many companies and many facilities that were disabled. They couldn't do anything for days once they received one of those packages because nobody was actually prepared on how to deal with it. So again, we don't want that to happen when we return to work, and God forbid somebody gets a package and people starts getting sick, then you have to shut your company or your office down after already been shut down working from home for several days or several weeks. That's the last thing we want. You know, lastly, I'll just mention something about travel policy, which, you know, companies should be thinking about how you're going to mitigate and what are the rules are going to be, how are they going to look like for domestic travel, for international travel? Do you quarantine people of abundance of caution? rearrange workspace? Are there going to be different time of work for different employees? Car parking. I mean, again, there were so many.
Yeah.
I will end it. Amrita was just saying that what's important is for any company to have a wide message to their employees, just to let them know that there are going to be some changes. So when people come in, they actually know and see the new look and the new procedures, so nobody's surprised. But we can talk about this for forever, but I'll just leave it as that right now.
Thanks so much, Andre. I mean, incredibly important points. I mean, from the travel to the communication plans to mail. I mean, there's so many different aspects of this return to work plan. And I mean, it's so important because if we don't have these plans, a resurgence can occur in our workspaces. So we have to be incredibly mindful of that. I'll move on to my second question, which is related to cyber. So I'll direct it to Amar. A lot of people think that, if they have a cyber issue, there's a potential cyber attack, immediately they should go, directly to their IT department. And so I'm wondering if there's, especially in the remote work environment, is there a gray area here? Should we be thinking about what individuals can do when they're working from home with regards to cyber attacks or the threat of cyber attacks, and how should we go about that?
Thanks, Amrita. I mean, as we discussed, I think the IT department has, or the security department, information security department has a strong responsibility to educate the workforce and to impart the knowledge, and then the responsibility is on the workforce at that point. The biggest key is again, the simple steps that were outlined, even 1, 2, 3, will mitigate a large portion of threat vectors coming in. But the other thing is the communication plan, as outlined. Make sure everybody knows who to call if an incident does happen. So, nobody is immune from all incidents, and something could happen. And the best way to mitigate it is for them to know who to call. Again, IT or security or somebody else, but that the employee really needs to know what that channel is, and the employee should be very encouraged to call that channel. Again, I would call something where the amnesty. It's not where you kind of tell employees, hey, I want you to do these 3 steps, and if you don't, there's going to be severe consequences. Make sure that they know I can go, and yeah, everybody messes up. The kids were driving me nuts or anything else like that in the house, and I messed up and I clicked on the link. Let them know that they can go somewhere, and we can start mitigating.
No, that's great. Thank you, Amar. I think back to some of the earlier points that were raised, especially given this pandemic, we were told sort of at the drop of a dime, we need to now work remotely. So having these communication plans in place are incredibly important. I'll pose one last question before I open it up to some of the Q&A questions I already have. I'll direct this one to Phil. And so, we have heard these terms thrown around: malinformation, misinformation, disinformation, within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Huge disinformation campaigns and misinformation campaigns we're seeing. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about, and you mentioned this briefly, the differences that we should be aware of between some of these terms and how they're showing up in the context of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's been a fascinating case study on the worst of what can be done in weaponized information. And at a macro level, so let's go up to rogue states and talk about sort of foreign nations. We know the Russians are active. We know the Russians are active through their RA bot farm with information. I'm just going to pick on the Chinese for a moment, though. There's a Chinese Communist Party official. His name is Li Jiangjiao, and he is a CPP official, and he is a prolific tweeter. And he is tweeting out everything he can, and the majority of which is intentionally inaccurate. If you look at CCTV, Chinese state TV, they've been taking charts from CDC's own website and then adding non-CDC information to it, and then pushing out both on their national TV channels, the CCTV, and also in social media and Weibo. There have been 2 social media campaigns that have been referencing disinformation, and they've been pushed out on Weibo. One of them has nearly 500 million impressions. The other one is 250 million impressions. So this is massive scale state-sponsored information. It's like, don't look over here, look over here. It's not us, it's those, it's the bad guys. So for example, in January 27th, most Chinese people at home and abroad were being told that they shouldn't worry about COVID, wasn't called that then, they should actually worry about seasonal flu in America, and saying that seasonal flu in America was at a 40-year high, and wear your mask to protect yourself from seasonal flu in America. Nothing to do with Wuhan. So that would be an example of state-sponsored disinformation. If I then saw those charts as a consumer and I thought, oh, wow, gosh, this must be true, and I share it with my 10 friends, that's now misinformation, okay? If I bring it down to a personal level, there was an email that got shared, and a few of us may have seen it. You know those old days where the sort of round robin emails? And this one, I'm just going to remind what it said. It said, quote, "This came from a group of people which are a pretty informed group." So there's a credibility line first. And then it talks about a young researcher who had been transferred from Shenzhen to Wuhan. Quite a few of us got that circulated email saying, hey, it's come from a trusted source and it's from a medical expert. It must be true. It then went on to say the virus dies at 80.6 degrees, false. Avoid drinking iced water, false. And expose yourself to sun. So this is a case of individual level within communities of misinformation that was probably originally put in for a distraction purpose and then is passed on by people in communities in an effort to be helpful. There is one source of truth. Go to the CDC. Support the CDC data with what you're seeing from your local state officials. And I think the governors are doing a brilliant job and they've all got websites. So look at your trusted media, look at your state officials, look at the CDC. If you want to know what's true on COVID, go to that source and be very, very careful. Again, think before you link.
Thank you so much, Phil. I mean, incredibly important points you raised on the credibility of the sources that we use. So I'm going to jump in. We don't have too much time, but I'll take at least one question or two from our audience. I'll pick this one up for now, anonymous. We're starting to see more tech companies like Google, Facebook, YouTube taking some measures to counter disinformation. And it seems as though these companies didn't move fast enough to address it. But now that they are taking on this fight, what should they keep in mind as they're taking some of these measures? So I'll direct that one to Phil.
And I need to give you a balanced response to this. There's a lot of responsibility with the platforms of what runs on them, and they can't say we're just the platform, it's encrypted, we can't be responsible for the content. I think that's an avoidance of responsibility. I applaud the efforts being made, and frankly, some of the tech giants are being faster and more progressive than others. But if they can't really control what it is, I think the individual responsibility comes down to us, the individual user. If we see something and it looks suspicious or too good to be true, what's that old saying? If it's too good to be true, it's not true. If we see something, go back to the DHS 5 steps and work out, is it a trusted source? Does it make sense? Can I validate the information? Do I reconcile it with my friends? Is it something that I believe to be true? So you can't really expect them to close the door completely. I think they could do more, is my honest answer. But rather than rely on an external source, I think we take the individual responsibility and the community responsibility, and we apply our own intellectual and logical filter to content to keep ourselves safe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Phil. I'll breeze through the next one before we wrap up because we're running out of time. So an interesting question on cyber. What would you recommend individuals do if they are cyber attacked and asked to pay ransom?
Okay.
Some immediate steps we may want to take on that front. Amar, I'll pass that to you.
Well, I mean, if we're talking individuals here, we're not talking large entities. Again, if it's a hospital that has all their medical records held hostage, that's a whole other ball game. And I would say call a lawyer right away on that. But as an individual, I would hope that. And again, coming from I'm going to call it an FBI bias, we really hate paying ransom, just as a matter of policy, whether it's for a person, whether it's for a hostage in Darfur, or whether it's for information, kind of feeding the criminal element in that regards. If your personal computer or your personal device is been taken ransom, really what you taken for ransom, you really need to know. Can I just recreate what's on there? Can I put it all back together? And if I can't, what I lose, is it really worth paying the ransom for? So on an individual level, quite honestly, again, it's one of the things that, the FBI is not going to get involved in. It really doesn't meet certain thresholds, and even local law enforcement might be overwhelmed. I'd report it to the IC3 website or the FBI's reporting website, just because it might help. It may help in the future, if we can get a lot of information there. Mm-hmm. But on an individual basis, again, hopefully you'll be able to just kind of recreate what you have and rebuild your system. Something that's great is preparation. So, if you either back up to the cloud, your Google Drive, if your photos are on, Amazon Prime or the whatnot, or if you have attached storage that you run backups, heck, even monthly backups on an individual basis may be okay. Attach and then detach. Good ransomware will find any kind of attached storage and go ahead and encrypt those files and hold them for you. But if you detach the storage, run your backups, detach, then you should have no problem recreating again on an individual basis. Hopefully, again, you can rebuild and recreate it. When we get into bigger entities, that's a whole other story.
Yeah. No, thank you, Amar, for that point. Important to think about. We don't know, what could happen at the individual level or even at the group level. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but please don't leave us yet. I wanted to wrap us up quickly. I wanted to first thank our impressive panelists for being with us today to educate us about the risks of working remotely and how we can address those risks. I think some incredibly important points were made, both common sense, but also things that I think we've really taken for granted over the course of our physical workspaces, disinformation, rogue infiltration, if you will. So I wanted to highlight just a few key points as we close. First, it's important to know the threat landscape and prepare for attacks, including by understanding the likely source of them and what formats and types might show up with respect to these kinds of attacks. I also want to emphasize to think about these issues as preparedness goals, 5 preparedness goals that were raised: prevent, protect, respond, recover, and mitigate. And in terms of protective measures, we can think about them in terms of the 4 Ds that we saw: deter, detect, delay, and deny. Second, we should try our best to be informed of the playbooks of our attackers and pre-plan countermeasures accordingly. Where possible, we should institute early warning systems and some level of a threat assessment scoring that was raised earlier. In particular, we should know when to observe, when to elevate, and when to respond to each threat. Thirdly, we should have those predetermined responses on hand and ready to deploy, and be thinking about something along the lines of a consistent loop cycle that includes monitoring, analyzing, reporting, learning, and sharing about the threat landscape and how we address it. And then finally, I'd just emphasize that preparedness and watchfulness are pretty low costs for all of us to do, but they're highly effective steps to help mitigate the risk and protect our colleagues and communities as we continue to work remotely. So with that, again, I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the Soufan Center for joining us today. You can reach out to the Soufan Group for any specific inquiries you have about remote working risks. There's a slide that will show in terms of who to contact, but it's info@soufangroup.com. So thank you so much again, and I hope you'll join us for the next webinar that we host. Thank you.